my world that I want to have a little pride in. My world, and it's not a place I have to hide in. Life's not worth a damn till you can say I am what I am.
Good afternoon and welcome to Dublin City FM. You're listening to LGBTQlife, Dublin's only and premier LGBTQ programme on radio, and I am delighted to welcome to the studio today Andrew Leavitt. Andrew, welcome to Dublin City FM and welcome to East Wall.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, Andrew, when I heard about this topic and I came across, we'll talk about the history of HIV and its emergence in a moment, but I came across an absolutely wonderful speaker a couple of weeks ago at this year's Pride, a gentleman called Daniel Santos. I believe he's from Brazil. I think a lot of people were at the Pride Parade. They were hearing his message for the first time. Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't. I mean, I've been talking to people in Dublin about HIV in the gay community in particular for many years now. I've been in Dublin for about 10 years. I'm not surprised by that. It's amazing how often I talk about what's happening with HIV in the community and how people are really, they don't know anything about this. This isn't something that's being widely discussed. I mean, it's something GCN has been, running articles. There's more discussion now than there was 3 or 4 years ago. But I think a lot of this is really outside of what people are running across.
You don't really get much of it in mainstream media, certainly newspapers and RTE. I can't really recall when I last heard the subject HIV/AIDS raised on RTE. What about yourself?
It comes up every now and then. You'll hear things on the radio occasionally, but yeah, it's pretty rare. And when it does get into the news, it's often it's presented in a way that feels like it's coming from the 80s or 90s. You'll see kind of blurred out pictures of people's backs or something as if HIV is something that is so shameful and needs to be hidden away that they can't get anyone to show their face. And so that's I mean, Daniel being on stage at Pride was really important to us because he was there as a person with HIV, talking about living with HIV, talking about the U equals U message, which is a kind of new thing, which is we now know that if someone has HIV and they're on treatment and they have an undetectable viral load, the medication is working, that they can't transmit HIV. Yeah. Whether they use condoms or not. So that was really important to have someone there talking about that, as a person living with HIV.
You've mentioned the 80s, and I just want to go back to that because you're from San Francisco, and I had just gone from San Francisco, and I landed in Sydney when I was migrating from London. And in 1980 or thereabouts, it was like the golden age of LGBT had suddenly arrived. We had gone from the 60s and the 70s, and particularly if you'd been to San Francisco at the time, it was just fabulous. It was like, it was like the Renaissance, and it was, so for anybody of that mindset, this was like a flowering. And then suddenly, I think it was about late 82, 83, we started hearing these stories about, Wayne has... he's got all these blotches on his face, and then suddenly it started to emerge, and the way it emerged was medieval. It was being portrayed as the gay plague, and
gay-related immune deficiency,
God's revenge, and all of this sort of stuff. Now, you would probably be a bit younger, too young to remember that, but the horror that was there will never leave people from my generation. What's your thoughts on that, Andrew?
Well, I mean, I'm a bit younger than you, but certainly when I was in high school and secondary school, this was part of gayness was this strong association with this really terrifying epidemic that was happening, and I was in Northern California, so certainly what was happening in San Francisco was very much, people knew about that. That was in the media, that was in the news there, in a way that's probably was more prominent than in a lot of places where this would have been kind of more of a taboo subject. So, that absolutely. I mean, for several generations of gay men, in particular gay and bisexual men, there's this strong association with this really terrifying disease, and that's I think that's and it's also a disease that left its mark in really decimating several generations. We lacked a lot of growing up, like coming in my 20s and in the 90s, there was a kind of generational gap between where there just weren't as many people, older gay men around, because so many had died.
Two things that I will always remember about that period, about how, first of all, it was socially divisive, because, as I say, between about 1980 and 1983, it was really hip. If you had parties, it was really hip to have gay people at your party. We all everybody mixed wonderfully, and it was tremendous and all of that. And people, shared this, they shared that. Then I remember I was at a party about early 1983 or thereabouts, and and these were very, very liberal people that would not have been out of place in California. And suddenly, the gay people weren't getting invited anymore, and people weren't sharing smokes anymore with gay people, and it was it wasn't something that was overtly spoken about. But I became very, very conscious of it, because it reminded me of, having had a Catholic education, this is treating people like lepers. Did you hear those sorts of stories when you were growing up in California?
Well, not about parties. I was 12 or 13 at the time, so I wasn't getting invited to those sorts of things. But, I mean, sure, there was a huge amount of fear and ignorance. You would have heard, AIDS jokes was a genre, right? About and that was very much a kind of blend of homophobic and AIDS-phobic kind of humor in scare quotes there. So that was true. That was absolutely part of growing up, and I think for and this probably still happens in truth, but certainly I know a lot of men my age whose, when they came out to their parents, one of their first things their parents would say was how concerned they were that we don't want you to die, we don't want you to get AIDS, that kind of thing.
It was considered a death sentence, wasn't it? And it was in most instances. And
it was also really terrifying, because no one, early on there was good reason to think that it was sexually transmitted, that it was a virus. Even before the virus had been identified, people had figured out that it wasn't something that was could be transmitted through sharing a cigarette or a glass or anything like that. But there was a lot of fear around it, and it was really built up in the media as this terrifying plague that was going to break out of the gay community and threaten everyone. And so there was a real sense of gay people being a kind of threat. And it's taken, even now, if you look at HIV Ireland did a survey last year. They did two surveys. One was asking people living with HIV about the stigma that they experience, and the other was looking at just kind of the general public and knowledge and attitudes about HIV. And they found that almost 20% of young people still think that HIV can be transmitted through kissing. So they don't realize it can't live outside the body for very long. No, it's actually a very difficult virus to transmit, despite the kind of outsized fear that still surrounds it and around transmission.
Well, one of the things, and I'll never forget it, because they used to have very tacky afternoon newspapers in Sydney when I was living there, and I remember this one, and it had a full banner headline saying AIDS from a mozzie. Now, a mozzie is a mosquito, and the story was that you could be in the equivalent of Castro, and and you're a good God-fearing Catholic boy, but this mosquito has bitten this gay guy down the road, and he can fly up the road and bite you, and therefore you'd get AIDS, and all the social stigma that went with that. Were you getting any of that sort of madness in the US at that time as well?
Oh, sure, yeah, of course. You had there are famous instances of people who wouldn't use a swimming pool, a chlorinated pool that had been used by somebody who had HIV and stuff. So you had a lot of just really baseless fears, but and it took a long time for official health authorities to really come out with clear statements of just to try to correct these mistaken assumptions about how it's transmitted and stuff. But that's work that is still it still needs to be done. There are still lingering misperceptions about this.
Yeah. I'd like to just move on a bit, Andrew, to the medical system. Now, again, I've experienced it from two sides. I remember, again, I was in Australia and we had this friend, and to be fair, she had a bit of a drinking issue, and she claimed she got raped, and she was worried then she got AIDS from being raped, etc., etc. So she was in hospital, and we went up to visit her, and she was in what we would then euphemistically call the AIDS ward. Now, I remember going up to visit her. It turns out she didn't. She was just, an attention seeker. But when we went there, and it was horrifying. It was like something from Night of the Living Dead, because you went in there and you saw these very emaciated people. It was like something from the Holocaust. And they were full of Kaposi sarcomas. Right. And that vision will never leave me, because I felt so sorry for those people. Was it more enlightened in your part of the world, or were those stigmas and those segregations were they prevalent as well?
Well, certainly you would have had AIDS wards in the U.S. Yeah, sure. Definitely. In fact, it was just reminding me that there's a show right now on TV called Pose. Which is about Black and Latino gay and trans people involved in the ballroom scene in New York City in the 1980s. And it's actually an amazing representation of the HIV crisis in that era. And the last episode featured... heavily featured an AIDS ward in New York, where one of the characters' lover is dying, and so this was definitely something that I think any large city that had a large population of people who were sick, who had AIDS and who were in hospital would have had these same kinds of scenes where and it was really, it's untreated HIV, the things that it does to a person's body is just appalling and
absolutely
unbearable. It's really, really hard to.
Well, one of the things I was always proud of the Australians, because they took a view that we are not going to be judgmental about your behaviour. What we are going to do is to try and make it safe. So very, very early in the piece, they had needle exchanges in the areas where people were users. They had condom exchanges from a very, very early age. They had big ads about safe sex on the television. So they went out of their way. Ireland, on the other hand, I think condoms were illegal even when
I think you gave them with a prescription.
It was very bizarre. But I remember the first time I came back here after I had moved to Australia was 1992. Now, my father at the time... he went in for a routine operation, and the next thing you know, he's had a heart attack and died. Now, we won't go into that. But what I remember, he was up in Beaumont, and people used to point out, that's the AIDS facility over there. And it was way, way, way away from the rest of the hospital. And I was also told, and I was more disgusted than horrified, is that people who had HIV, who had died of HIV, they were buried in body bags. Now, for the Irish funeral culture, that's anathema because you don't get to see. Did you hear of any? I can't imagine it happening where you were, but something like that to me just showed up the ignorance of the place at the time.
Well, I think in terms of the medical stuff that it, certainly in the Bay Area you wouldn't have seen that kind of thing. Certainly not as late as 1992. But what you certainly saw was a lot of difficulties around families and people who had men who had really created a new family in San Francisco, moved from a smaller state or something to New York or LA or San Francisco, and had really created a circle of friends and family. And what you had a lot was the people's birth families coming in when they had died and claiming the body and taking it away and refusing to allow their actual friends to attend the funeral, and then often lovers would be excluded from being able to to attend that memorial.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I get choked up when I.
Please do, Andrew. I understand. I haven't talked about the subject for a while, and it's not because I've blocked it out, but it is just such a difficult subject.
It really,
I mean, I would have lost at least 30 friends. Now that's small compared to other people who are full time in the gay community. But again, something else that I can recall. It was never really spoken about, because we all lost friends. And then a couple of prominent people came along, and Rock Hudson being the first one. But I remember when Liberace contracted AIDS, they were still coming out with this nonsense about, no, he doesn't have AIDS, he's on the watermelon diet. Yeah. And for years people were making jokes about the watermelon diet, not in a homophobic way, but in more or less as a commentary on the dishonesty of the entertainment business. Do you think that was important, that when we saw prominent people catching it, irrespective of whatever previous image we had, that it brought it home that this is not a respecter of anybody, this condition?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's a series of kind of famous people coming out with HIV. Yeah. So yeah, certainly Rock Hudson was
he would have been the first
landmark. Yeah. But you did see this kind of denial like around it, and this real desire to hide it. So I think with Freddie Mercury, there was, I'm not even sure when it was acknowledged that yes, he had died of AIDS. And then in the U.S. you had Arthur Ashe. That was a sort of.
But Arthur was okay because he got up to a blood transfusion.
Exactly. It finally opened it beyond sort of like gay men who got this through sex or something. And then Magic Johnson as well was another really like big. In terms of broadening the conversation and stuff.
Well, that was important, really, wasn't it? Because suddenly people saw, hold on, this is not a democratic disease, and it's not God's revenge on gay people either. So in that regard, I think that was very, very important. The other aspect, and I often think about this, particularly because I describe it as the LGBT Holocaust, and what I mean by that is that. The number of people that we lost. I mean, we lost an entire generation of creative people who know. I mean, so a lot of people who would have been the role models or people that you would have looked up to. Suddenly we're no longer there. Right, I mean, to me that was a real tragedy.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Larry Kramer, who founded ACTUP in New York in 1987. Has a book that's called Reports from the Holocaust, and that's his writings about the early days of AIDS up until about the time of founding ACTUP. So I mean that was it was a metaphor that probably struck a lot of people as kind of dramatic and overstated and overblown, but really, I mean that's I think that's for a lot of people that's exactly how it felt. It was just this unimaginable kind of.
Well, one of the people who I will always have the utmost respect for coming out of that period was Elizabeth Taylor, because Elizabeth, she never disowned her friend. She was there right to the very end for Rock Hudson, which I thought that's mensch, as we say. Moving along then, Andrew, you're here in Ireland, and most people, because it's out of the news, we think it's a non-issue, but people are still catching HIV. What's the situation in terms of health treatment? I know you met Minister Simon Harris last week.
No, we haven't.
Oh, you haven't met him yet?
No. We stopped by the Department of Health to see if he was in, but apparently he wasn't available right then. But we are working on. He's said verbally a couple of times that he would be willing to meet with us, and he's so we're and we have several communications in to his office. And we are working on that.
Okay, no, that was one of the things. Do you think that when we saw how the Eighth Amendment was changed here, suddenly all these people who probably would have been not in favour of it even just a few years ago, suddenly their empathy levels just rose through the roof as in parallel with the polls. Do you think that the same issue is there in relation to HIV medical services? In the Irish health service, and particularly the Irish political system.
So, I mean, in terms of health services, I think it's important to make clear, because a lot of people don't know this, but if you're diagnosed with HIV in Ireland, all of the medical care and the treatment is provided free of cost. So that's something that I know that when people are getting tested, this is often part of what they're concerned about is, gosh, if I do get a reactive result or a positive diagnosis, how am I going to pay for this? What kind of costs are going to be involved? I think it's important to let people know that care and treatment is provided for free, and Ireland actually does a fairly good job in terms of providing this care. We know that there's some drop off between being diagnosed and actually being enrolled in and staying in care, but once people are in care, they're on treatment, like the vast majority of people are on treatment and are virally suppressed, and so the treatment is working effectively. Okay. So that's great. But what we're really looking at is PrEP is sort of what we really would like to talk to Simon Harris about most of all. And PrEP is pre-exposure prophylaxis. So that's when someone who is HIV negative uses some of the same medication that's used to treat HIV, and they take that as a daily pill or around the time that they're having sex, and that's a very, very effective way to prevent HIV for HIV negative people. And so that's something that the HSE doesn't provide right now. And Simon Harris has said, he said recently that the HSE should have a PrEP program starting in January of 2019. But we don't know what the details of that are. We don't know what it looks like, and we think that it's really important that the community be involved in helping determine what those services look like and how they work, and that it really needs to be a partnership to be effective.
From your work within the community, and I'd be very interested to hear your view on this. There's an entire generation. I believe there's anecdotal evidence that because HIV/AIDS hasn't been in the news, people think it's not that easy to catch. And even if it does, like I was mentioning earlier, it's not the same death sentence that it was. However, and this is again something I'm very, very keen to hear from you about, what I'm hearing, and I've no evidence of this from researchers, is that a lot of people who catch HIV also catch Hep C. And the people aren't dying from HIV, but they are dying from Hep C because they're never getting it diagnosed and they're continuing on. Now, I say this because I am somebody who was diagnosed with Hep C, and I actually continued it till the very end, so I believe I'm free of it. But two other friends of mine, same age, same lifestyle, they also caught Hep C. They continued doing what they were doing, and in the Irish case, that means large industrial-style drinking. Both of them died of liver cancer in the last couple of years. I think what saved me was the fact that I gave up drinking when the rave scene came along. What are you hearing about that, and are you recommending people should also be tested for Hep C?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. and we know that there, particularly among gay and bisexual men with HIV, that there is a higher incidence or rate of diagnosis of hepatitis C. Sorry, men living with HIV. Yeah. That also there's an association with a higher risk for Hep C. Yeah. Yes. And so we think that it is important for both HIV positive and negative people to get tested for Hep C. It's still, the prevalence is much lower than HIV at this point, and Hep C is actually curable now, right? We have some effective cures. Unfortunately, they're extremely expensive. So in Ireland, you basically it's another waiting list. I mean, surprise, healthcare. There's a waiting list, but essentially they don't. You won't get that cure for Hep C until you're kind of an advanced stage. But it is really important that if you do have Hep C or Hep B or Hep A, that you know it, that you get whatever treatment is available, and that you avoid anything that's going to aggravate your liver.
I raised this because I had an AIDS test, as we would say, in 1989, and that came back clear, and I thought, phew, I put that down to good luck rather than good management. Now, for out of the blue, in I think it was 2002, I was with another radio station, and we got this fax at the time. You're probably too young to remember fax.
I did. I remember faxes. I did. But yes.
One of these things came in, and it said it was from the blood donation services, and they said we're short of O negative, which is my blood group. So I thought I'd be like one of those George Plimpton interviews, and I went in there with my microphone and we did an interview as I gave blood and all of that, and it was great. And they wrote back to me about 2 or 3 weeks later. They said, "Thank you, Michael. That was fabulous. It was great, for promoting blood donations. And by the way, you've got Hep C." And I was horrified. I was absolutely horrified because there was no symptoms that I would have noticed. And this is why I say to people, if you could have Hep C, but you would never know, and then by that stage you would it can be very, very difficult to arrest it, particularly if you continue drinking and you're getting liver damage. Now, I went through the treatment. It was 6 months, and I won't say it wasn't a holiday, but it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, because it took me nearly a year. I was so terrified of doing this that it took me nearly a year to face up to it. And then when I did, I became the poster boy because I did everything that they said, and I got rid of it, and here I am now, 15 years later. But that's why I would like to emphasise that if you're doing certain things, and we know what they are, get out there and do it. Get out there and get tested.
And at this point, if you're a gay or bisexual man and you go in for an STI screening, they should include Hep C as part of what they're testing for. It's just check another box for the blood test. And but absolutely, it's something that.
Well, what's a very interesting one? I'll just finish this point, Andrew, because you've got an event coming up that I want you to tell people with. But before I did, when they were, instead of asking me how I felt or anything like that, I got this big list of how might you have got it? And they all said, did you do this, did you do that? Now, what I said to them, and we're going back 15 years here now, when there wasn't that much cocaine in Ireland, and I said, I thought I got it from sharing notes with people. And I'm not a big coke fan user these days, so I'm going to share that. They had never even thought of that. That was a possible way.
Oh, right. No, that is.
And I thought that was a real way of catching it. I just want to warn people, because cocaine is much more prevalent now, and it's much more shared.
That's right.
Moving on, Andrew, you've got an event this Thursday evening. Tell us about it.
So this Thursday at Outhouse in the theater at 6:30 p.m. We have an event called Preparing for PrEP, and it's an open community forum about PrEP and sexual health services more generally in Ireland. We're going to have a couple of great speakers, including Pierre Cedric Crouch from the Magnet Clinic in San Francisco, who helped design and roll out a really like a community-based PrEP program that has been really successful, and we think would be really interesting for people here to learn about.
And it's everybody's welcome.
And everyone's welcome. It's free. Just turn up. No pre-ticketing, and we're really going to encourage people to participate in the conversation and the discussion as well.
Okay, Andrew, we're getting signs from the signal box to say we might bring that event next week. People, I want to say thank you to Andrew Leavitt from ACTUP Dublin, and I want to say thank you to Aisling for doing a wonderful job in the desk. And don't go anywhere, because coming up after this is Brazilian coffee.
That I want to have a little pride in my world, and it's not a place I have to hide in. Life's not worth a damn till you can say